NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
I don't know if everyone saw in Staten Island last week, there was police officers also caught on body camera planting evidence, and the New York Times, in New York Times fashion, wrote the headline as, "What do you see?" Because, you know, they don't want to do anything. Do I have a clicker? Oh, it's right here. Just use the arrow, that's not working. That's not working. Go ahead. I was inspired by this billboard that I saw coming from the airport last night. It's for some terrible company, I'm sure, that does probably something awful, but that's not what this conference is about. What I do want to talk about, though, is how in all of the ways, just when you thought you wanted to throw your phone out of, into the ocean, the way that I do after this morning, we have been trying to put some information that defenders can use on their phone and feel, good about data collection in one way. We are in one of those states in New York that doesn't have any information about internal affairs files. I mean, talk about difficult. We have to make a motion that the evidence we don't know about or have no access to is relevant to our case before we can get that evidence. And so that's the state of our ability to access that information. And in order to do that, we have to give some good faith basis that that information exists. And creating this database that's accessible to our defenders in New York City and to other institutional defenders in New York City was our answer to that. And we've tried to collect as much information as possible for everyone. Now, this is usually a 90-minute presentation that I'm going to do in 15 minutes. So I'm going to fly. If you want to talk to me more about it later, I'm very happy to talk about it. We're working on producing something we can export to other defender offices as well. So we do a daily search of information that feeds our database, and that includes just news. We go to NYPD.news, which is an automated blog we created, and we look for basically anything that is coming up in the news on that day that has NYPD plus an officer's name in it, and if it has an officer's name in it, we include that on their profile. We have 34,000 officers in the NYPD. All of them have profiles on our database. About 10,000 of them have misconduct related to them. In addition to the news search, we also have interns that go to public disciplinary hearings. So the hearings themselves are public, and there's a public expectation of access to disciplinary hearings in New York, but no expectation of access to any documents, transcripts, or related filings. And so in order to find out anything that happened at a disciplinary hearing, you actually have to be there. So we send interns there, they take reports, they come back, and we add those reports to the database as well. You can find out if you have a local civilian complaint review board. You can find that out from Nicole's website. You can also go to, Nicole should tell you whether or not there's public hearings available, and ours has, for example, a public hearing schedule on the website. But the best thing to do is to call them and find out when the next trials are. We also include information from criminal court decisions. So our appellate unit on a daily basis sends out, maybe other defender offices do this as well, sort of the dailies, right? All the decisions from the day from around New York State or relevant federal jurisdictions that have information. We get incredibility decisions. We had 2 incredibility decisions just last week. Suppression decisions, sometimes other types of decisions like facial insufficiency, those types of things can also get thrown in there as well. And then PACER, we do a huge amount of work on PACER, and this is something you can do in any jurisdiction. If you have civil rights lawyers who are filing complaints, they're documenting misconduct. It might not be misconduct that has the type of weight of the Internal Investigations Division, but it is a report of a civil rights violation, usually. Usually there is some Fourth Amendment violation, some lying, even a false arrest involves a series of fabrications, right? And so you can collect prior bad act evidence by going to PACER, looking up your local jurisdiction, going to a docket report, looking up an officer, and finding out how many times he's been accused of misconduct. And sometimes you need to do a few more steps. You have to call the plaintiff's lawyer and get more details about what they learned, perhaps after they filed the initial pleadings, because what is on PACER might not be all of the information that they learned about in that case. And what we do, if there was, for example, a deposition, we also take that deposition and we put that in the database as well. And then social media investigations. This is moving on from the daily searches that we do to feed our database to when we do a deeper dive into an officer, then we will sort of collect information from a social media investigation. And we'll find officers who, say really great things online about our clients that totally reveal their biases and their, very pro-cop racist attitude. And Brady letters. Sometimes, once in a while, we go to trial. When we go to trial, we'll usually get a Brady letter the night before. We got a Brady letter in Brooklyn a few years ago for an officer who had a bunch of racist posts on Facebook and who had also had several substantiated uses of force and was even on force monitoring. We got that the night before trial in a case that had been like 2.5 years old. We found out as soon as we looked him up that since then he had actually been moved to Queens. But our Queens attorneys, instead of having to wait until their cases with him started to go to trial 2 and 3 years later, had that information up front. Lots of his cases were getting dismissed. Internal affairs records. Once in a while, we get them. New York City, we have an internal affairs bureau, which is the cops investigating themselves, which goes really well. And then we also have the civilian complaint review board, which goes only slightly better. They have increased the amount of officers that are actually getting charged slightly, but we can talk more about that over drinks. Westlaw is a really great place to look for information about police. If you are investigating an officer, putting just their name in quotes and NYPD into a Westlaw search bar finds a lot of information. We found a lot of incredibility decisions that way. And we also find some officers who are fired and then sue for their job back that way. And that has led to a bunch of really fun cases that, again, we can talk about later. We also look in our internal case management system. So we look up an officer's arrest history. We found that one cop has made all of his arrests in 3 different places in the last year. We found another cop who only made arrests outside of one bar in Staten Island that served mostly a Mexican population. We found another officer who just had a really odd number of one type of arrest, and because that was their go-to thing. It was strange though. It was like moped violations. And this officer had also, we found on Westlaw, been charged with, been fired for misuse of an NYPD moped. It was a really weird, moped fixation thing. So you never know what you're gonna find, but it will all be on your phone, ideally. And so our attorneys can take their smartphones, their pads. We have problems in our courthouses where we have 1 or 2 computers that are actually desktop computers, and they're usually being used by the clerks that are organizing the files pre-arraignment. And so our attorneys needed to have something that they can just go to and not have to wait in line to get on the desktops. So this is available to people on their smartphones, that they can also put it on their desktops. Most of them use it on their desktops. And the identifying information for the officers are there, their salaries, their start dates, the overtime that they get in hours, the overtime they get in dollars, and where they rank. So for some officers, if they're ranking in 95 percentile of overtime earners, that is a red flag for us, because then we're thinking maybe you're not motivated by your neutral observation of crime in an opportunistic way, but you're really just trying to earn some more overtime dollars on the end of the arrest. We do a lot of cool things with our data. We're going to release a public website. This is a social network analysis based on the lawsuits that we did for the past 2 years. So all the lawsuits we've been collecting in a systematic way, we were able to figure out all the relationships between officers that are sued together. This helps us, for example, in narcotics cases, when you don't really know, there's 1 arresting officer named, but there's 8 other officers and you don't know who they are, and maybe their names were rambled off during a hearing, but you didn't really catch them. This has helped us be able to identify officers so we can investigate them well before the hearing or well before the trial. But this sort of looks crazy sometimes, and it's important, and Deb mentioned it, and I want to go through it really fast, that it's not good enough to walk into court and be like, he's bad. He's bad, and he's a liar, and he beats people up. That's not working. And we've had a lot of judges really dismiss us for not being able to provide much more grounded reasons for why this information should be admissible, why it should be the basis for more discovery or the basis for suppression. So just really quickly, again, this is 90 minutes and 15. We can do this in more detail later. Making the argument that it's material is really crucial. And these are all ways that we argue it's material in New York. They're based on New York cases, but I'm sure that the principles are applicable in the jurisdictions that you all practice in. Credibility with respect to the issues the jury has to resolve. Like, judge, this cop is really bad at telling the difference between Jolly Ranchers and meth. Like, because of past cases, we've used that one, actually. An officer's bias, not joking. We had another cotton candy one last week, too. It's weird. New York City's weird. So hostility, like I've sued this cop before, those kind of things. These are all principles that you can rely on to go into court and say, this isn't just me standing up and wanting to be like, that cop's bad and generally unreliable or generally incredible. This cop is, prior bad acts are relevant in this case in a really specific material way that makes this much more central. And my ability to question this cop on these questions central, my ability to get more information about this cop much more central to my entire case. And if you are making those materiality arguments and relying on confrontation clause in the Constitution and on the cases that Deb put up, the Pennsylvania v. Ritchie and Davis v. Alaska, you're on much more solid ground. And we've had a lot greater success lately at being able to not just walk into court prepared to scare the pants off the ADA who didn't know what we know about their cop, but also prepared to defend the right to use that information in court. Because credibility is collateral, right? What the judges are used to doing is saying, like, that's great, he's a bad guy, I get it, but I don't think it's enough it's not the type of information that's really going to make a difference. So I'll let you ask a few questions, but then move on. Judges have a lot more ability to stop you from getting deep into an officer's misconduct history if it's not material. So make those materiality arguments, ground them in the Constitution. Make a record. What I suggest attorneys do, the most important part for preserving the appeal, is to make a court exhibit that you ask the court to mark. When they tell you you can't ask the questions about a cop's prior misconduct, say, well, here's a list of the questions I want to ask, Judge, and here's a few cases that defend my right to ask them, and you can just put that in your court file so that that's clear on appeal. And usually in our experience, judges have suddenly been like, you know what, ask them. Get done. Mention the Constitution and re-argue a subpoena, right? If you're suddenly finding out from the cop on cross-examination that, yeah, I do have an internal affairs file, and that subpoena to get that file earlier was denied, then re-argue if you can. We also use this information to make Brady arguments. Tupac made a Brady argument in New York City a while ago, doesn't matter. Suppression. And someone mentioned Utah v. Streif and Sotomayor's wonderful dissent in Utah v. Streif. And absolutely, we've been using this information to say that if what Utah v. Streif says is that we have to come in and give a reason to employ the evidentiary rule and deter misconduct through the Fourth Amendment, then we have to prove a pattern and use the information that you want to get or use that standard as a reason to get more information, although, we don't want to raise the burden for ourselves too much at the same time, right? And then also motions for dismissal in the interest of justice. We've successfully just handed over a dossier of prior bad acts of police officers and a really, sympathetic case, and those two things combined have been really successful for us in terms of getting a few cases dismissed. We're still playing with experiments in the grand jury context, but in New York, we can't get access to that information, but grand jurors can. And so in cases where it makes sense, we are prepping our clients to say, by the way, this officer has prior misconduct that you, the grand jury, can access. I can't get the exact files myself. And so we're thinking of new ways to try to get the grand jury to push for that information as well, because in New York City, that's one of the few entities that can. If you have questions, email me or find me later. I'm here today and tomorrow. I'm also, as my father says, a twit. And so I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time. I know that we're pretty short. We have 1 minute for questions. Yeah? Yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an issue happening for us as well in some cases, and I know it happens a lot more in some of in other defender offices. I think that there's it's a good place to make an argument to unseal and or suggest that there is redactions instead of sealing. It's difficult, and it might not be an argument available in every jurisdiction, but we are contemplating making a First Amendment motion of right of access to court filings under a First Amendment framework. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, but essentially there's, if there's a public expectation to accessibility and to publicity in a criminal trial in the context of criminal court, especially where the right to access in court is strongest, then you can make arguments that the public expectation, the history of publicity in that context, as well as the benefits of transparency, especially around police misconduct records, would all serve that information not be limited by a protective order. Other questions? Done. Okay.